This isn't a story I'm proud of, but it's mine. It's the absolute truth of what happened to me and my family, and how I learned that some roots are so rotten, you have no choice but to burn the whole tree to the ground. The polished mahogany of the dining table reflected the grim faces of my family like a dark, still pond. We were gathered for the first Thanksgiving since my mother's passing, but the air wasn't thick with grief, it was sharp with predatory silence. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table, his knuckles white around a leather-bound folder, and in the moment he cleared his throat, I saw my brother Julian flash a smirk at my sister Charlotte, a flicker of triumphant cruelty that told me everything. My father slid the folder across the table toward me and said, "Your mother's final wishes have been amended, Ethan." We felt her judgment was clouded at the end. Inside that folder wasn't a will, it was an eviction notice from my own life, and the only crows at that table were the ones wearing my last name. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The weeks leading up to that Thanksgiving were a blur of hollow condolences and the cloying scent of funeral lilies. Our family home in New York's Hudson Valley, a sprawling colonial estate named Blackwood Manor, felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. I was the one who had stayed. While my brother Julian was busy conquering Wall Street and my sister Charlotte was marrying into a political dynasty in D.C., I was the one holding my mother's hand as the cancer ate away at her memory, then her life. My father, a man who treated emotion as a market commodity to be bought and sold, was conspicuously absent, always citing business with his firm in Manhattan. My mother had always told me, her voice a papery whisper in those final days, "This house is yours, Ethan. It's the only part of this family with a soul left." She'd shown me her will, signed and notarized, leaving the house and a controlling interest in her personal trust to me. It was her way of thanking me, of protecting me from the cold calculus of my father and siblings. I believed her. That was my first mistake. After the funeral, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Julian and Charlotte descended upon it like vultures, their conversations ceasing the moment I entered a room. They took inventory of the antiques, appraised the silver, and spoke of the property taxes in hushed, urgent tones. I thought it was just their nature, transactional and cold. I was a poet, a part-time professor at Vassar. I didn't speak their language of asset liquidation. I let them be, retreating into my grief and the quiet corners of the house that still held my mother's scent. My father treated me with a new kind of dismissive pity, patting me on the shoulder and saying things like, "Don't you worry about the estate, son. We'll handle the complexities." The complexities, I would learn, were the legal machinations they had been planning for months, a meticulously crafted campaign to paint my mother as mentally incompetent in her final year and portray me as a manipulative caregiver who had coerced her. That Thanksgiving was meant to be the final nail in my coffin, a formal declaration of my exile. They didn't just want to disinherit me, they wanted to humiliate me, to break me in the very room where my mother once hosted happy family dinners. As I sat there, staring at the legal document that gave me a token sum, just enough to be insulting, and a 30-day notice to vacate Blackwood Manor, I felt the floor drop out from under my world. My throat was tight, my hands shaking. I looked from Julian's smug, satisfied face to Charlotte's feigned sympathy, and finally to my father's icy stare. There was no family here. There was only a corporation, and I was a liability that had just been written off. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. The silence was absolute. I didn't shout, I didn't plead. I just looked my father in the eye and gave him a single, quiet nod. They thought they had won, that the quiet, artistic son would simply crumble and disappear. But in that moment, staring at their predatory faces, I felt the grief in my chest harden into something else, something cold and patient and sharp. They hadn't just taken my inheritance, they had given my life a new, singular purpose. And as I walked out of that dining room, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a war they didn't even know I was willing to fight. The first week after the ambush was a living hell. I moved into a cheap, transient motel off Route 9, the kind of place with flickering fluorescent lights and the lingering smell of stale cigarettes. Every morning, I'd wake up with a jolt, The image of my family's faces, smug, unified, triumphant, burned into my mind. They had everything: the money, the power, the prestigious law firm of Caldwell and Finch in Manhattan on retainer. I had a few $1,000s to my name and a growing pile of legal papers designed to intimidate me into submission. My lawyer, a small-town guy named David, was honest. "Ethan, they've built a fortress," he'd said, sifting through the documents. "They have affidavits from doctors, a psychiatrist I'm sure they paid a fortune for, all claiming your mother wasn't of sound mind. They're framing you as a classic case of undue influence. They had poisoned everything. My mother, a woman of sharp wit and fierce love, was being posthumously painted as a doddering fool, and I, the son who gave up his life to care for her, was a monster. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I spent my days driving past the gates of Blackwood Manor, watching them come and go in their polished German cars, living in my home. One rainy afternoon, I was back in the motel room, sorting through the few boxes of my mother's things I'd been allowed to take. They were mostly personal effects, photo albums, old letters, worn books of poetry. I was about to give up, to let the bitterness consume me whole, when my fingers brushed against a false bottom in her old mahogany writing box. My heart hammered against my ribs. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a small, leather-bound journal and a single, ornate brass key. I had never seen either before. My hands trembled as I opened the journal. Her elegant script filled the pages, but this wasn't the diary of a woman losing her mind. This was a ledger. For years, my mother had been meticulously documenting every suspicious financial transaction my father and Julian had made. She detailed how they'd leveraged her private investment portfolio for a risky venture in Dubai without her consent, how my father had established a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, and how Julian had been siphoning funds from her trust to pay off gambling debts. Those all their dates, account numbers, names. She knew. She had known for years what they were, and she was building a case against them. But there was more. The last few entries were frantic. She wrote about how they were bringing in new doctors, how her regular staff were being replaced, how they were trying to get her to sign new estate documents. "Richard is a wolf," she wrote. "He is waiting for me to die so he can devour everything. Ethan is the only one who is good, and they will destroy him to get to my money. I must protect my boy." Tucked into the final page was a note. "The truth is buried with the sins of this family. 212. I didn't understand the number, but I knew what the key was for. There was a branch of Hudson Valley Bank in Poughkeepsie where my mother kept a private safe deposit box, one my father knew nothing about. She had told me about it once, years ago, calling it her escape hatch. Suddenly, the grief and despair I'd been drowning in were burned away by a white-hot surge of adrenaline. They hadn't just cheated a dying woman. They had been actively plotting against her while she was alive, isolating her, trying to break her will. This wasn't just about my inheritance anymore. It was about her. It was about justice for a woman they had silenced. They thought they had buried all the secrets, but they didn't realize my mother had left me a map. The drive to the Hudson Valley Bank in Poughkeepsie felt like a pilgrimage. The old brass key was cold and heavy in my palm, a final piece of my mother's will she had managed to hide from the wolves. The bank itself was an old, imposing granite building, the kind of place that whispered of old money and buried secrets. I was a nervous wreck, convinced my father or Julian would somehow have anticipated this, that an alarm would sound, that their lawyers would materialize out of thin air. But the bank manager, a portly man who remembered my mother fondly, simply checked my ID, confirmed my name as the secondary holder on the account, and led me down into the vault. The air grew cool and still as he unlocked the heavy steel gate. He used his key, then I used mine. The sound of the lock on box 212 tumbling open was deafening in the silence. Inside was not what I expected. There were no stock certificates, no bundles of cash. There was only a thick stack of yellow documents tied with a faded ribbon, and a single, small, velvet bag. My hands shook as I untied the ribbon. The documents were the original deeds and founding charters for the Blackwood estate, dating back to the late 1800s. But beneath them was a sworn, notarized affidavit from my great-grandfather's business partner, a man named Silas Croft. The affidavit told a story I had never heard, a story the family had spent over a century bearing. Our entire fortune, the very foundation of the Blackwood name, was built on a lie. My great-grandfather hadn't purchased the land, he had stolen it. He had used a series of predatory loans and fraudulent legal challenges to bankrupt a community of free black farmers who had owned the land for generations, buying it up for pennies on the dollar at a corrupt sheriff's auction. Silas Croft's statement was a damning, detailed confession of their conspiracy. My family's legacy, their pride, their position in the Hudson Valley Society, it was all built on the ruins of other people's lives. It was a crime so old and so profound it was almost biblical. I finally understood what my mother meant by the sins of this family. Then I opened the small velvet bag. Inside was a single, heavy, gold signet ring. It wasn't a Blackwood ring. It bore the crest of my father's family, the Caldwells. And I remembered a story my mother once told me about my paternal grandfather, a man who died before I was born. He wasn't a blue blood from the Hudson Valley. He was a low-level numbers runner for the mob in New York City who changed his name and disappeared after a witness in a federal trial against his boss was found dead. He used his payout to reinvent himself as an aristocrat. My father's entire life, his obsession with legacy and appearances, was a desperate attempt to outrun the shadow of his own father's sordid, criminal past. My family wasn't just greedy. They were frauds from the very beginning. The Blackwood name was built on theft, and the Caldwell name was laundered through crime. They had all the power, all the money, all the influence. They seemed utterly untouchable, parading their stolen legacy at charity galas and sitting on museum boards. They had erased history and rewritten their own. And in that cold, silent vault, I realized they had left me with nothing, which meant I had nothing to lose. I had their original sins in my hands, the two foundational lies upon which their entire empire was built. They thought I was a poet. They were about to find out I was a historian, and I was going to unbury every last one of their skeletons. I walked out of that bank a different man. The poet, the grieving son, the victim. He was gone. In his place was something colder, more focused. I was no longer defending myself, I was on the attack. I drove straight from Poughkeepsie not to my lawyer's office, but to the New York Public Library in Manhattan. For 2 weeks, I lived in their archives. I became a ghost haunting the microfiche machines and dusty county record books. I cross-referenced the names from Silas Croft's affidavit with historical census data and property logs. I found them, the descendants of the families whose land my great-grandfather had stolen. Most were scattered, their family histories fractured by the poverty that followed the loss of their land. But one family, the Hendersons, had stayed in the area. Their patriarch, a man named Marcus Henderson, was a 90-year-old retired history teacher living in a small, neat house in Beacon. He was the great-grandson of the man my family had ruined. When I knocked on his door, my heart was pounding. I had the stolen documents in my briefcase. I introduced myself, and he looked at me with weary, intelligent eyes. He knew the name Blackwood. To his family, it was a curse word, a story of injustice passed down through generations, but they never had any proof. I sat at his simple kitchen table, the smell of brewing coffee in the air, and I laid out the truth. I handed him the affidavit and the original deeds. I watched as a century of pain and righteous anger played out across his face. When he was done reading, he looked up at me, his eyes shining. "I knew it," he whispered. "My whole life I knew it." We had a common enemy. I then spent every last dollar I had to hire a different kind of lawyer. Not a small-town defender, but a shark. Her name was Elena Ramirez, a specialist in historical reclamation and class-action lawsuits. She was known for dismantling corporate empires and old money dynasties. When I presented her with the documents and the connection to the Henderson family, her eyes lit up with a feral kind of glee. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face, "this isn't just a lawsuit. This is a reckoning." While Elena began quietly assembling a massive class-action suit on behalf of the Henderson family and others, I turned my attention to my father. I hired a private investigator, a grizzled ex-NYPD detective, and gave him one target: My grandfather. Find out everything you can about the disappearance and reinvention of Franklin Caldwell, I told him. It was a long shot, a 70-year-old cold case, but my father's arrogance was his weakness. He believed his past was buried so deep it could never be found. He was wrong. My resolve was absolute. I was no longer a member of their family. I was an instrument of their history, a debt that had finally come to collect. I would not rest until the name Blackwood was nothing but a cautionary tale whispered in the drawing rooms of the Hudson Valley, a story of how an empire built on lies was brought down by the one son they thought was worthless. The war had begun, and I had just fired the first 2 cannons, aimed directly at the foundations of their kingdom. They wouldn't even know what hit them until the walls were already crashing down. The first tremor hit on a Tuesday. An article appeared in a small but respected historical journal, a carefully researched piece by an acclaimed academic about predatory land acquisition patterns in the Hudson Valley during the Reconstruction era. It didn't name my family, not directly, but it detailed the exact methods Silas Croft had confessed to, focusing on the very land Blackwood Manor now sat on. It was my first strategic leak, a warning shot. I watched from the sidelines as the whispers started in our social circles. My father, I heard through old family acquaintances, was furious but dismissive, calling it academic sensationalism. He had no idea it was the first step in a meticulously planned siege. My PI, the ex-cop named Russo, hit pay dirt a week later. In the dusty archives of a Queens courthouse, he found the original case file for the mob boss my grandfather had worked for. And in it, a name, Franklin Cellini. Not Caldwell. He had anglicized it. Russo also found a faded photograph of the prosecution's key witness, a man who had vanished just before the trial. The man looked eerily like the official portrait of my grandfather that hung in my father's study. The final piece was a redacted informant's report that hinted the witness had been paid off by a rival family to disappear and was given a new identity. The mob hadn't killed him, they had bought him. My grandfather wasn't just a runner. He was a traitor who sold his testimony and used the blood money to buy his way into high society. My father's entire identity was a sham. Now, it was time to turn the siblings against each other. I knew Julian's weakness was his desperate need for my father's approval, coupled with a massive gambling problem he thought he kept hidden. Using a burner phone and a voice modulator, I called the concierge at the Bellagio in Las Vegas, pretending to be a credit investigator from American Express. Citing Julian's full name and date of birth, I casually asked to verify the settlement of his outstanding markers. The concierge, without confirming a specific amount, said, "Mr. Blackwood's account is in good standing with the casino, sir." That was all I needed. The confirmation of a private credit line. I sent an anonymous, encrypted email to the CFO of my father's firm. The subject line was simply, Julian Blackwood's risk profile. The body contained the dates of Julian's last 5 trips to Vegas, the name of the casino host who managed his private line of credit, and a simple question, is this the kind of financial judgment you want managing your emerging markets fund? My father, a man who valued control and reputation above all else, would be apoplectic. To destabilize Charlotte, I used her own snobbery against her. She was trying to get her husband appointed to a federal judgeship, a process that involved intense FBI vetting. I sent another anonymous package, this time to the lead senator on the Judiciary Committee. Inside was the evidence of my grandfather's true identity as Franklin Cellini and a copy of the old mob informant's report. The package included a note. Perhaps you should ask the Blackwood family about the source of their seed money. Some legacies are not what they seem. I was systematically dismantling the pillars of their power, their history, their finances, and their political connections. I had planted seeds of doubt and chaos, turning their own secrets and ambitions into weapons against them. They were so busy fighting these new fires, they never saw Elena Ramirez and the Henderson lawsuit coming. It was a storm gathering just over the horizon, and they were standing in the open, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was about to give way. The storm broke on the night of the annual Blackwood Foundation Charity Gala. It was the pinnacle of my family's social calendar, an ostentatious display of their power and philanthropy held in a grand tent on the lawns of the estate. 200 of New York's most influential people were in attendance: bankers, politicians, society mavens. My father would be giving the keynote address, a self-congratulatory speech about legacy and community. It was the perfect stage for their downfall. I was miles away, sitting in my drab motel room, watching a pirated video feed from a sympathetic catering employee I'd paid off. The escalation had worked perfectly. Julian had been quietly removed from his position at the firm, his relationship with our father strained to the breaking point. Charlotte's husband's judicial nomination was suddenly stalled in committee, with rumors of a skeletons-in-the-closet issues swirling through D.C. The family was fractured, paranoid, and distracted, just as I'd planned. As my father stepped up to the podium, basking in the applause, Elena Ramirez made her move. At precisely 8:15 p.m., a press release from her office hit the wire services. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, every major news outlet received it simultaneously. The headline was devastating. Descendants of disenfranchised farmers file landmark lawsuit against prominent Hudson Valley family, allege century-old land theft. The release contained excerpts from the Silas Croft affidavit. While that digital bomb was exploding, a second one landed. A well-regarded true crime blogger, whom Russo had anonymously tipped off, published a long-form exposé titled, "The Ghost of Franklin Cellini: How Mob Money Forged an American Dynasty." It detailed my grandfather's criminal past and my father's fraudulent heritage. Back at the gala, my father began his speech. "Legacy," he said, his voice resonating with false sincerity, "is not about what you inherit, but what you build." His words were cut short by the sudden, collective buzz of 200 smartphones. Faces tilted down, illuminated by the glow of their screens. A wave of murmurs rippled through the tent, growing into a shocked roar. I saw my brother Julian staring at his phone, his face ashen. Charlotte looked like she was going to be physically ill. My father, confused, faltered at the podium. And then, the final act began. As if on cue, a procession of vehicles came up the long driveway, not the sleek town cars of the guests, but the humble sedans and trucks of the Henderson family and the other plaintiffs. They were led by Marcus Henderson, looking regal in his Sunday best, and the formidable Elena Ramirez. They didn't shout or cause a scene. They walked calmly to the entrance of the tent, where a U.S. Marshal was waiting. In full view of everyone, he served my father with the lawsuit. The flash of cameras from the press, who had been tipped off by Elena's office, erupted like lightning. My father stood frozen, a piece of paper in his hand, his perfect world utterly shattered on live television and across the internet. His legacy wasn't being built, it was being publicly, humiliatingly, and irrevocably demolished. From my motel room, I watched the panic, the chaos, the beautiful, magnificent implosion of my family. I took a slow sip of cheap whiskey, the screen reflecting the flashing lights of news vans descending upon my former home. The crows had finally come home to roost. The aftermath was a slow, agonizing death for the Blackwood name. The lawsuit was a legal behemoth, a public relations nightmare from which they could never recover. Their friends abandoned them overnight. Their business partners severed ties. The Blackwood Foundation collapsed as donors demanded their money back. The story of Franklin Cellini made my father a pariah, the punchline to a grim joke about the American dream. The family, once a united front of vipers, turned on each other with a ferocity I could only have imagined. Julian, convinced my father had leaked the story about his gambling to ruin him, sued our father for mismanagement of the family trust. Charlotte, her husband's career destroyed, publicly disavowed our father and filed a lawsuit of her own, claiming her inheritance had been devalued by his moral and financial recklessness. Their corporate empire, built on a foundation of lies, was being devoured from within by the same greed that had sustained it for generations. Blackwood Manor was the first thing to go. It was placed in a court-appointed trust as part of the initial proceedings with the Henderson lawsuit. The legal fees were astronomical, bleeding them dry. My father, a man who once commanded boardrooms, now looked like a ghost, aged a decade in a matter of months, shuttling between depositions and meetings with an ever-shrinking team of lawyers. He lost everything. The company, the house, his reputation, and finally, his family. 6 months after the gala, I sat across from Elena Ramirez in her sleek Manhattan office overlooking Central Park. The Hendersons and the other families had won a landmark settlement. It didn't restore everything that was stolen, but it was a form of justice a century in the making. A significant portion of the remaining Blackwood assets, including the land itself, was transferred to a community trust managed by the descendants. As for me, I wanted nothing. I had declined to join the suit. This was never about money. Before I left her office, Elena looked at me with a curious expression. "You know," she said, "you could have taken them for millions yourself. Why didn't you?" I thought about it for a moment, about the shell of a man my father had become, about the hollowed-out lives of my siblings. I had won. I had avenged my mother. I had taken a pickaxe to the rotten core of my family and brought the whole edifice down. I was free. But I found no joy in the victory, only a profound and chilling emptiness. I walked out into the crisp autumn air, a man with no family, no history, and no home to return to. I had burned it all down, and only I knew the true cost of the fire. The end.